Welcome Krishna Keshava Das, a researcher and was a serving assistant to Dr. B. Madhava Puri since 2018. He majored in liberal studies and held double minors in sustainability and philosophy/religion during a non-traditional undergraduate experience at Stockton University from 2012 through 2025. Current services with the BVI include organizing the annual Science and Scientists Conference Series, facilitating community programs sharing Bhagavat Culture, and publishing interdisciplinary academic articles exploring the origin, purpose, and evolution of matter, life, consciousness, and self from the perspectives of Eastern Bhagavat Vedantic and Western Hegelian wisdom. And his talk will be on the dialectics of niche construction and biomimicry.
Okay, so as Yater said, my talk will be on the dialectics of niche construction and biomimicry. And I think this topic will follow very nicely from Dr. Wer's discussion of Goethe's inner nature and outer environment and the relationship that these two aspects have um, in a non reductionistic way. So the first part of the talk is about the dialectical view of niche construction. Ever since the Altenburg 16 conference at the Konrad Lorenz Institute in July 2008, there has been a growing consensus among scientists and other thinkers that an extended evolutionary synthesis is needed. Thus far, the conclusions of 21st century biology have demonstrated that gene-centric views of organisms are misleading, and that purpose and cognition hold fundamental importance in organizing and governing biological activity. These developments demonstrate that the modern synthesis, or neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, which has dominated biology for 165 years, may be outdated. One area of interest to the extended evolutionary synthesis is niche construction theory, which describes how organisms actively co-constructing their immediate environment or niche affects their adaptation and evolution. The significance of articulating this phenomena is to balance the scales for people who think that organisms are passively shaped by the environment without reciprocation, as held by J. Baird Callicott. He says, quote, "A species is what it is because it is adapted to a niche in the ecosystem. The whole, the system itself, thus literally and quite straightforwardly shapes and forms its component parts." End quote. While evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin actively described organism-environment feedback in papers on adaptation throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and the technical term niche construction was coined in 1988 by John Odling Smee, the phenomena has been studied by biologists since at least Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882. In his book, The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms in 1881, which was the last major publication of Darwin's life, he analyzed the feedback that occurred as earthworms adapted to live in soil, an environment that they modify through their own activities. Through their burrowing and excretion in soil, worms' activities aerate, add organic matter to, and drain the soil, which reciprocally affects the environmental conditions that they live in and adapt to. Some argue that traditional niche construction theory overemphasizes the quantitative aspects of the organism-environment feedback, such as objective transformations of the environment, including coral reefs, beaver dams, and nest or burrow building. There is a call to recognize experiential niche construction, where the qualitative experience and subjectivity of the organism is considered, i.e., the underlying meaning and purpose driving their activities in relation to the environment. This allows us to consider more subtle phenomena, such as affordances, and leads to a dialectical perspective of niche construction's inner workings. The first observation regarding the organism-environment relationship for any observer is that whether an individual is breathing, eating, mating, or creating a niche, it is driven to take from and modify the environment. This familiar and straightforward fact should not be overlooked. It implies that the individual lacks something in itself. It is not self-sufficient. It requires things from the environment to survive, and because its actions in relation to such things are the organism's only means of self-preservation or self-determination, the particular environmental aspects which the organism interacts with and the manner in which it interacts are both meaningful. Those aspects of the environment that a particular species does not engage with are not explicitly meaningful to it. Lions aren't interested in cities, and eagles don't favor caves. There may be exceptions to the rule, but they don't establish reproducing populations in these places. An organism's subjectivity is empirically observed through its particular behavioral interests. Rasmus Haukedel put it concisely when he said, quote, "The organism relates to the environment and changes which parts of its surroundings are relevant to it. It does not merely react to quantitative changes from a generic environment, but responds to qualitative differences that are related to its history and current status. This determination of the environment is also a determination of itself as an individual." End quote. And the reference for that quote you'll see at the end of the presentation. In this regard, Hegel explained that, quote, "Insofar as the object confronts the living being in the first instance as an indifferent externality, it can act upon it mechanically. But in doing so, it is not acting as on a living being. Where it enters into relationship with a living being, it does not act on it as a cause, but excites it. Because the living being is an urge, externality cannot approach or enter it except insofar as it is in its own very nature already in the living being. Therefore, the action on the subject consists merely in the latter finding the externality presented to it conformable." End quote. Hegel argued that when the environment acts on an organism mechanically, it is...
Sorry, what was that?
Sorry about that. A little interruption. Hegel argued that when the environment acts on an organism mechanically, it is not a living relation. For example, when a woman floats down a river so that the environment exerts a mechanical force on her, she might as well be an inert plank of wood. The same can be said of a meerkat lying on the ground. However, to the extent that environmental factors trigger or elicit an organism's engagement in meaningful ways, this constitutes the basis for a living relationship. When a flowing river inspires a woman to construct a watermill to power her home, or a meerkat burrows into the ground, this is an organic relationship. A living connection is established. The degree to which an organism perceives specific environmental conditions as potentially fulfilling its inner lack, is the extent to which it assimilates these conditions to overcome this lack and actualize itself externally. As Dr. Haukedale said, by determining its niche, the organism determines itself. Actually, as Dr. B.M. Puri pointed out at our conference 2 years ago, every determination is a negation. This is an often quoted phrase of Spinoza, omnis determinatio est negatio, which is used by Hegel. I will not go into detail about the significance of negation here, but it is crucial for any proper study of biological activity. Niche construction is experiential because it is an expression of self-determination. It is the affirmation of inner self-feeling through external self-expression. This is dialectical in the Hegelian sense because, despite being opposites, this externality is not foreign or independent of the organism's inner experience. Using the terms Umgebung and Umwelt of biosemioticien Jacob von Uexküll, the external environment, or Umgebung, initially passively invites the organism to interact with a subset of its possibilities, according to the organism's preferences or inner purpose, which is essentially its survival needs. Every species, and perhaps even individuals within a single species, will have different survival needs and thus will utilize a different subset of the external environment. This subset is the experienced environment, or the Umwelt. To be clear, the Umwelt is not merely subjective, but it is a product of the objective relationship between the external environment's possibilities and the organism's needs. Ecological psychology refers to the emergent action potentials from the organism-environment relationship as affordances. After being passively prompted by the external environment, the Umgebung, and perceiving its experienced environment, the Umwelt, the organism determines or posits itself by assimilating the experienced environment to its preferences, the qualities that satisfy its inner lack and fulfill its drive to survive. Assimilation of the Umwelt occurs through the organism's behavioral activities, which result from exploiting affordances, thereby establishing the niche as an extension of the organism's functioning. We might poetically say that habits form habitats. To the extent that skeptics still suspect a pre-existing external environment prior to active construction and the contributions of inhabitants, it is worth acknowledging that even the immediate environment is a product of the habitation of previous generations of living entities. Even among the present generation of organisms, due to the interconnectedness and proliferation of life, the niche of one organism becomes a part of the environmental possibility space for others to create their own niches. This circular, interpenetrating relation between environment and organism is dialectical because of its conceptual structure as a simultaneous identity in difference, in which a unity exists that preserves co-constitutive diversity as functional moments within an ongoing dynamic process of becoming. Now that we've hopefully established the experiential nuances of organism-environment feedback and how they demonstrate the dialectical nature of niche construction in general, we'll proceed to examine positive human niche construction responses to the present ecological crisis on Earth, and how these further demonstrate the relevance of dialectical thinking. So part 2 is on biomimicry and cultural evolution. It is exciting to see scholarship studying scientific practice as ecological enactive co-construction. Such work is highly consistent with the overarching premise of the Science and Scientists Conference series, which Dr. B. Madhava Puri established in 2013. The question that inspired him was, the scientist can explain science, but can science explain the scientist? A 2023 paper discusses science as an expression of human niche construction, while recognizing niche construction to be dialectical. It says, in analogy to this view in biology, we describe scientific knowledge as developing through an interactive, iterative process in which the objects investigated, i.e. phenomena in the real world, and the investigating subjects, i.e. scientists, constrain, i.e. restrict and enable, each other's activity, and jointly contribute to the co-construction of scientific knowledge. But beyond mere analogy, the proposal is to understand this co-constructive process as literally continuous with biological niche construction. By developing ever novel ways of acting in, interacting with, and making sense of the world, scientific practice enriches human cognitive embodiment and drive human niche construction activity in new directions that both constrain and are constrained by the world. This mutual constraining, i.e. mutual restricting and enabling, is evident in how what becomes a recognizable phenomena depends on the scientist's needs and interests, or what scientists are looking for. Yet, at the same time, you can't find what isn't there, and you can sometimes find what you weren't looking for. The possibilities for intervention, experimentation, and observation are affordances, and as such, they are relational and dialectically constituted. That is, they exist not only for and because of the scientist as the subject attuning to these possibilities, but also for and because of what the object of investigation is like, including how it reacts and thereby shapes the scientist's subsequent range of affordances, needs, and interests. Scientific knowledge as a relation and activity, and scientific theory as a practice, are thus neither socially constructed nor human reconstructions of mind-independent reality, but they arise dialectically, interactively, and iteratively through human niche construction activity as joint co-constructions of organism-environment systems. Again, there will be a list of references at the end of the presentation. So that ends the quote. Let's hone in on the sentence, the possibilities for intervention, experimentation, and observation are affordances, and as such, they are relational and dialectically constituted. End quote. So, as will be seen, the practice of biomimicry is a product of affordances in human niche construction. The innate action potentials within the external environment offer affordances, possible ways for subjects to use objects, based on the organism's unique capacities. This is exactly how the field of biomimicry emerges. In the human form of life, affordances include exploring how the one forms, two behaviors, or three overarching systems of life on Earth can be biomimetically utilized to establish sustainable and regenerative niches for humanity in harmony with nature. Biomimicry gained popularity as a formal discipline around 1997 when biologist Janine Benyus published Biomimicry: Innovation Inspired by Nature. So, as the field of biomimicry has been formalized, it specifically focuses on the forms, behaviors, or overarching systems of biology, where it seems that actually the modeling human technology or other innovations off of the systems is a little more difficult, but the forms and behaviors of biology seem more readily accessible to biomimicry specialists. Here on the slide, we have one of the classic examples of biomimicry. An engineer on the Japanese Shinkansen bullet train noticed that, I don't have a photo here of what the train used to look like, but it had a very round, kind of obtruse nose to the train, and it would pass through a tunnel, and every time it exited the tunnel, due to the buildup of pressure because of the speed of the train, there'd be a giant sonic boom sound when it exited. So one of the main engineers was also a birder, and he was noticing that the kingfisher bird, it didn't cause a splash in the water when the tip of its beak entered into water to catch a fish, as you can see in the photo on the right. So, he had some open-minded consciousness about how this inspired the design of the new bullet train, which you can see on the left. So this is an example of how the form of biology can influence technology. And as I'll argue, so from the systems level, this is something that we're working on now, there are cultural practices that can be biomimetically modeled after certain aspects of systems like the nutrient cycle, which has implications for how we deal with waste. Examples of that are what has been called circle economy or donut economics, which follows, in the nutrient cycle, whatever, a plant grows and then the leaves fall off and they degrade into the soil, which is not just a waste, but it becomes a feedback. It nourishes the soil for a new plant to grow. So that has implications for how waste products of various different kinds can be used in our human society. So scholars have argued that the emergence of biomimicry exemplifies dialectical cultural evolution, as Hegel describes historical development. So this is a quote from a recent paper. Technology based on instrumental rationality has been the primary way in which human beings relate to and enframe the natural world. It represents the rationality of the human mind. Therefore, it conflicts with natural systems, which follow their own unique rationality, harming them in various ways. The technology that is emerging as a result of this disequilibrium, that is, this contradiction, is a new technology of symbiosis. It is an organic technology that refers to the logic of the natural world as well as human rationality, rather than singularly the human mind. Biomimicry is technological response to the contradiction, the disequilibria, both experienced and anticipated, that has been brought on by the traditional treatment of nature by human beings. From a Hegelian point of view, the resolution of a contradiction always carries the contradiction itself along into the solution in a new sublated form. Biomimicry is not a solution to technological enframing. It is a rather new form of enframing that allows for a new relationship and engagement with nature. In this way, it changes our experience of the world and thereby our thinking. A further problem is that examples provided may not necessarily show a shift in rationality, but just in how human beings relate to nature. Once again, if we embrace a Hegelian perspective, any change in nature or self reflects a change in rationality. This is because such a change is a rethinking of our relationship to the other in this case being the natural world. The change in rationality that is occurring is that of human beings coming to see that our rationality is nature's rationality. Therefore, because nature and the self share the same rational structure, it is not a new form of rationality that is produced, but rather the overcoming of a conflicting form of rational thinking and its alignment with the rationality of nature." End quote. Although Hegel himself did not explicitly use the thesis, antithesis, synthesis wording to describe his dialectical method, in this case it is helpful to simplify the stages of historical development that led to the emergence of biomimicry. As long as the antithesis proves to be produced out of the thesis itself, and the resolution of the two follows suit, then such a description seems properly considered Hegelian. So there are two phases of this historical development. The first thesis is the so-called state of nature, where the primitive human was dominated by wilderness and the fight to survive. The reason I say so-called here is because I come from a deep practice of the Vaishnava tradition of ancient India, the Vedic tradition. And there's a very, very different idea of human history in the Vedic tradition. So although this talk is not about that, it's worth noting that the traditional Western idea that man was just another primate and in a state of nature like all the rest of the primates, and then slowly came to a civilized position, that's not a universally held position, and there is lots of ancient literature in the Vedic tradition that gives a very different idea. So I'll just leave that, for today. So the antithesis to the idea of the state of nature and humans being dominated by wilderness, the antithesis is that humanity's struggle to develop tools, labor, and social structures producing more leisure time. So that's a resistance to that state of nature. That's why it's an antithesis. And then the synthesis is an advanced civilization with agriculture, industry, science, and technology. Of course, just generalizing the progress from the age of agriculture to the Industrial Revolution, Scientific Revolution, and our current age of technology. And that's a synthesis because the struggle against the state of nature ceased to be a struggle, and some form of relationship, consistent relationship with nature was established. But as we'll see in the next phase of the development, so the synthesis becomes the thesis at the next level, the advanced civilization with agriculture, industry, science, and technology. The antithesis to that is a worldwide mental and environmental health crisis produced by the cultural progress based on instrumental rationality. Instrumental rationality means thinking that nature is an instrument of human satisfaction or exploitation, rather than trying to understand the agency that lies in nature and harmonizing with that, and understanding how, if humans really are somehow an advanced stage of nature, that doesn't mean dominance over nature, but harmony with it and evolution with it, respecting the other living entities that are in nature and the integrity of the planet as a whole. So that's the antithesis to the modern civilization. And the synthesis now, we argue, is innovative, eco-friendly approaches to agriculture, industry, science, and technology, such as biomimicry, which are, have been starting to emerge over the last couple of decades, and hopefully will continue to expand in their influence and impact. So this development represents an evolution of consciousness in which humanity's rebellion against the environment, initially understood as a foreign oppressor to be conquered, gave way to recognition that this enemy was a reflection of humanity's own self, and that the struggle was against our own best interest. This evolution is moving toward higher prospects in which our sense of self extends beyond isolated individuality toward a greater degree of interconnectedness and wholeness. As our inner self-feeling develops, the manner in which we externally determine ourselves through life activities like niche construction also changes, thereby driving social and cultural evolution. This expansive movement of consciousness has sufficient momentum to transform the world in which we live. Thus, almost 2 years ago, Dr. B.M. Puri told me that, quote, biomimicry seems a perfect example of the Vedic idea of Atmavan Manyate Jagat. The intelligence that the subject sees in the object is the mirror reflection of the subject's own intelligence. This is the dialectical relation of identity and difference between the subject and object. So this idea, Atmavan Manyate Jagat, is at the foundation of the Eastern wisdom that comes from the development of the Vedas to Vedanta, and finally culminating in the Bhagavat, that Atmavan means the soul or the consciousness of the soul, and Manyate Jagat means it shapes the world. Jagat means the world. So the world in which we live is a product of how we see things, of, you can say, our own biases to some extent. The world in which we live is a product of our own biases and preferences. So as those develop, also the world within which we develop. So, in conclusion, Dr. Puri's guidance and teachings are the inspiration behind my talk. By the grace of Sri Guru and Gauranga, I will conclude with an instructive quote from Hegel. A rational consideration of nature must consider how nature is in its own self this process of becoming, spirit, of sublating its otherness, and how the idea is present in each grade or level of nature itself. Estranged from the idea, nature is only the corpse of the understanding. Nature is, however, only implicitly the idea, and Schelling therefore called her a petrified intelligence, others even a frozen intelligence. But God does not remain petrified and dead. The very stones cry out and raise themselves to spirit. So, here what Hegel is presenting is that matter, life, and spirit, these are not mutually exclusive terms. They represent a continuum of conscious development. Dr. Puri explained it as comparing it to sound and silence. Sound and silence are opposites, but they're not mutually exclusive. Silence is a degree of completely attenuated sound. There's no sound. But then as you crank up the sound from the state of silence, you get a loud sound. So it's a degree, the relationship between sound and silence is a degree of attenuation. So in the same way, Dr. Puri explained the relationship between spirit, life, and matter as a degree of attenuation of consciousness. That matter is spirit dialed all the way down. Our conception of life is somewhere in between. And spirit is that fully awakened consciousness. So this is what we have to offer today. Here are the references for some of the things that we've mentioned. I have to give credit to Dr. Rasmus Sandis Haukadale, who was a presenter at last year's Science and Scientists Conference. His work in his doctoral thesis from 2023 on Hegel, the extended evolutionary synthesis, and the dialectical nature of niche construction was a big influence on some of the things that I presented. And his thesis was recently published as a book, like a couple of weeks ago, in Springer Nature Link. The title of the book is Agency and Organization, the Dialectics of Nature and Life. So we'll leave that information there. And that's all we have. Yes, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. I see one comment Pardon my interruption, but it should be clarified that Hegel does not view the human as a natural being, although nature is his actuality. Yes, Hegel, in the development of his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, Hegel puts the human as the transition from the sphere of nature to the sphere of spirit due to the human capacity for self consciousness. That living entities um, represent, again, that degree of attenuation of consciousness where they are engaged in cognitive activities, even at the level of the single cell, as we see discussed in the work of scientists like Dr. James A. Shapiro, who spoke at our conference last year. Even a single cell makes decisions, cooperates, and solves problems in novel ways. But, as Barbara McClintock asked in her Nobel lecture, how conscious of a cell, how conscious is the cell of its own activities? We would argue that the cell is conscious of its environment and has the capacity to respond in cognitive ways, but it's not self-reflective of that process. We would argue that probably many members of the plant and animal kingdom aren't self-reflective of their cognitive activities, and that the human form of life is unique in that way, that we can ask, well, why am I doing this? What is my purpose? Like that. So this is why Hegel puts the human as the transitional moment between nature and spirit, where his anthropology is the first section of the Encyclopedia of Spirit. So yes, that's worth acknowledging. Thank you, Anand.
I guess I'll throw a question out there. Hi, thanks for your talk. So I have a feeling today that we're going to hear a lot about some of these kinds of same things. My own paper later is going to talk about, at a general level, some of these views of biology or organic systems that Hegel has. Um, But I'm kind of wondering, the view is that Hegel thinks our thought determinations really align um, with those of the um, Geist of beyond the. I mean, there's at least lots of readings of Hegel, so I guess we can start with that. The Hegel scholarship doesn't give us one. Um, but I'm wondering if you think he's really a little over optimistic that our own rationality reflects somehow or is able to capture um, the ultimate rationality. I can't quite remember how you put it, but um, was something to the effect that our rationality and the rationality of the Geist are strictly parallel. And it would seem to me that we're somewhat weaker agents than Hegel makes us out to be.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Arnold, for that question. I believe the section of my presentation you're referring to is when I was quoting from a scholar who was showing the parallels between biomimicry and Hegel, and he was giving the argument that our mind has the same rational structure as nature to the extent that nature is intelligible to us. That the reason a human mind can um, access some of the truths of nature as they appear to human consciousness is because our mind has the same kind of structure as nature, and it identifies those similarities in nature and is able to describe them. Um, of course,
But I,
quantum physicist Werner Heisenberg tells us that science isn't really about nature; it's about nature as it presents itself to us. So This is the distinction between, in itself and for consciousness, which is an important distinction to make. As you rightly said, we are finite. We have limitation. My understanding of Hegel, which of course is not perfect, is that his position isn't that the human rationality can capture Geist in its totality, but is that so that it's not an effort where the finite asserts its understanding, right? Because Hegel makes a distinction between Verstand and Vernunft, the understanding and reason, where the understanding is more where we try to separate things into categories. It's more analytic. It's more an assertion of a finite attempt to reduce things, reduce a whole to parts, and understand the parts and then re-put them together to have an understanding of the whole. Hegel doesn't think very much of the capacity of the understanding. But his explanation of what is the Vernunft is that it's the inherent movement of thought itself unfolding through human rationality and beyond. So that human rationality is a moment of Geist, or the absolute, in coming to know itself. It's one, the finitude of human rationality is just one moment of that far greater process of spirit coming to know itself. So to the extent that us as finite individuals, and my explanation here is also coming from what I've learned from the Vedantic side, right? That has shaped my understanding of Hegel, which is the whole project of Dr. B. Madhava Puri, who's my teacher. So rather than thinking it's a finite effort, that the individual, to think it's a finite effort is to keep the individual human as external to that which it's knowing, rather than thinking that it's a part of that and a moment of that greater context. So reason, Vernunft, is then a level beyond the understanding, where the human recognizing that it's just a finite moment in the context of this greater process of, we can say freely in a philosophical or religious sense, of God coming to know God's self. But that's as far as I can try to explain my understanding. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. If you don't mind my interjection here, I would like to respond to Mr. Arnold. From what I understand about what is a problem here is that you find a certain degree of hesitation in determining whether God, as the ultimate rationality, can be known to us humans. If I can offer the answer that Hegel may offer, or what is the Hegelian answer to this, is simply to understand what the query here is doing. What it is doing is truly knowing what it is which limits or supposedly limits human cognition. And paradoxically, in knowing it as the externality of the limit, says that it is not related to the limit. But the truth is that insofar as something is limited, the outside of the limit is as much related to the inside of the limit. In fact, there is no inside without the outside which limits it. So the Hegelian answer here would be that insofar as we know that which is outside our limit and limits us, the outside is as much within our knowledge as it is known by us. So we know that God, in your instance, is this beyond which we supposedly don't know, and yet is determinate to us, and therefore is known as a limiting other.
Thank you, Anand. There's a lot was just said there, Dr. Arnold.
Oh, sorry, were you still going to continue? I was going to ask a question, but if not, I'll wait.
Yeah, Mark, I think Dr. Arnold just because he asked, he wanted to follow up with the responses that were offered to his question, if that's the case.
I don't, yeah, I mean, that seems like, well, a reading of Hegel. So I would just say you could kind of say that the everything would be a part of the absolute, and so you could say the same thing about a bee or a bird or something um, in some basic way. But the limits of the bird and the bee are different than the limits of the human mind. I just think that Hegel tends to be over optimistic about the human mind ability to grasp the absolute. So, but we'll leave it at that.
Mark, did you you wanted to add something?
Yeah, not added to the previous discussion, a question that goes in a different direction. When you were talking about niche construction, one of the main thoughts that came to mind was early in the philosophy of rights when Hegel's discussing the development of property. Um, and how property is, in some sense, an externalization of the internal freedom of the will of the individual, of the specific persons, and the property being that. And I'm curious, do you use, I know this is more a biology talk, but do you spend much time thinking about like the relationship of that with, in terms of objective spirits, in terms of the state? Is that something of interest to you?
So from my side, it's not something I've explored so much, but as far as I understand, Dr. Arnold is actually, based on his comments to Dr. Wers earlier, it seems that he has some more familiarity with that. I don't know if he'd like to comment.
You know, I'm really so sorry. Um, this is very early in Miami, where I am. And as you were talking, my wife brought in a piece of toast because I hadn't had breakfast. So I missed, I really apologize, but I missed the details of your comment. I don't know if you could
No, no
summarize it
problem.
very quickly and then I can try to respond in some way.
Yeah, basically just the topic of niche construction and biomimicry, or niche construction, that drew an immediate relation in my mind to the discussion of property early on in the philosophy of rights. And insofar as what is called the niche construction seems to be just the externalization of inner will um, to matter, to make the objects around you in relationship to your own will. And I was curious about if there were any links that Krishna had made. I'm not sure if you have anything to comment on it.
So, Dr. Arnold, based on what I heard you saying to Dr. Wers, that you have some more familiarity with Hegel's um, likening the organic principles to the state. So that's why I thought maybe you would have a contribution here.
No, I'm sorry, but I don't really have anything that I can offhand say that would be a particularly productive comment to that. I think it's always interesting in Hegel to look for these types of similarities because he does look at, you know, the system of the state as an organism. He calls it one, talks about it in organic terminology and so on, and he applies that, I think, quite generally to other systems. But I, you know, given I guess the context at which I'm coming to this, I don't really have anything productive to say. So thank you.
I think it actually would be interesting to consider this idea of the extended organism. A physiologist named Dr. J. Scott Turner, who we are friendly with, he has a book called The Extended Organism, and he studies, based on his studies of termites in Africa, who build these massive mounds of dirt above ground, even though their colony lives deep beneath the ground. And these above ground mounds serve as functional lungs to help air circulate into the colony deep beneath the ground. So he takes that as an example of what he calls the extended organism, where these functional structures that serve the biological activity of the organism can be considered as justifiably part of the organism, even though, it's outside of the boundary of the tissue of the immediate organism. So I think that kind of idea, and he argues from his perspective, is helps to give credence to the idea of the Gaia principle, where ultimately, to the extent that the biome and the abiotic things going on there are facilitating the biological activity of living entities, that it can be considered an extended organism. So I think that's relevant to Hegel's using the term organism in such a liberal way, to the extent that social structures serve functions maybe beyond biological functions, maybe even cognitive functions of humans. So in that way, the state could be considered an extended organism, an extended human. As far as how that relates to biomimicry, so I tried to present how biomimicry leads or is a product of cultural evolution. Something I'm working on as a separate paper from this conference that my talk is helping to shape is a particular cultural manifestation of following the principle of biomimicry. And I mentioned it briefly actually in the talk, like circle economics. So that's an example of how biomimicry influences social structures, right? We look at the nutrient cycle and we say, hey, let's look at our economic structure and see how it's dealing with waste, and how it's maybe not efficiently or optimally utilizing waste. Let's take the example from the nutrient cycle and figure out ways to plug in our society's waste as feedback for new and innovative systems. So that I think maybe that's one example. But I think there's justification for Hegel's use of the word organism for the state as far as the extended organism is concerned.
That's very interesting.
So I think maybe there's about 5 minutes left in this session. If there's any other questions or comments, or if not, we can move on to the next speaker.